tracking the pulse of the road and the future of flight. From viral trends to policy shifts, we cut through the traffic to bring you the stories that drive us. Your fast-track guide to everything on the move starts right now. From the Billionaire News Channel studio to Metal 947 BFM, I'm Paolo del Rosario, and this is Shift Happens. Ngayon ay maaraw na Miyerkules, and yes, the sun is shining, it is red hot, but it's even hotter in the studio. Why? Because my favorite co-host every Wednesday, the motoring editor of Business World and the man behind Uncap, Ginoong Cap Maceda Aguila, is looking very fine here in the Barong.
I read the memo, unlike some people.
I did not read the memo, okay? Look, I promise you, hindi po impeachment yung coverage namin today. We are actually tackling something a bit more historical, and I'm excited for that. Because, ladies and gentlemen, before the jeepney, before the bus, before the car, ang tanong natin ngayon, how did the Filipinos get from one place to another? From bull carts and horse-drawn carriages to the first forms of public transport, the way Filipinos have moved has changed dramatically over the years. But transportation isn't just about the vehicles that we ride. It's also about the cities that we build, the communities that we create, and the way that society itself evolves. As Manila grew, so did our need to move faster and further. The rise of the automobile, the birth of the jeepney, and the expansion of Metro Manila, and all the things we know today. Decades have passed, yet many of the challenges we face on the road still feel familiar. How did we get here? And more importantly, what can the history of Philippine transportation tell us about where we go next?
In this National History Month special, we go back in time to trace the origins of mobility in the Philippines. Now joining us today is a historian, associate professor at the Department of History of Ateneo de Manila University, and chief editor of the Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. He is an accomplished author and one of the recipients of the 2025 National Book Development Board Publication Grant for his upcoming book, Immobile Metropolis, A History of Motorized Transportation in Manila. Abangan ko to. Please welcome Michael Pante.
Maraming salamat. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I am nerding out. Kanina pa kami nag-uusap. I love my history, and I love the fact that we're talking about moving along in the Philippines. How is it safe to say, in general, focusing on Metro Manila here, that mobility has been a constant conversation because it feels like the modes of transport have evolved with literally every era of Manila?
Yes, mobility is a very important part of the growth of any kind of metropolis, any kind of settlement. And for one, we cannot divorce the discussion of mobility from the idea of urbanization, meaning the separation between the places of work and the places of residence. So the idea of commuting, for instance, it doesn't make sense for people who are in a rural society. Because if they are planting where more or less they are also, in the area where they are also living, there's no great demand for them to have another extra layer or another extra service for mobility. Whereas for people who are in an urban setting, more or less, their places of residence are kilometers away from their places of work.
Now, it was a very interesting point that Paolo was raising earlier before we went on air. Has Manila, I'm focusing on Manila, meaning metropolitan Manila, has it always been designed to be pedestrian friendly, meaning in the way that it's constructed perhaps since the time of, before the time of motorization? Was it already an effectively planned metropolis, you think?
Well, unfortunately, in the case of urban planning, most of the time, the people behind these plans are politicians, people who are of high position in society, people who come from well-off backgrounds. And the thing here is that when these are the people who make plans, the tendency is they make plans for their own social class. So for instance, in the case of our current urban plans, it's politicians who are SUV riding elites, and the tendency there is to prioritize the mobility of automobiles. And I think if we go back in time, more or less the same thing applies to them. For instance, in the planning of Intramuros, there was no conscious effort on the part of the Spaniards to create a plan in which Indios would be able to move freely. In fact, the whole idea behind Intramuros being a gated community was to prevent free mobility of people who were suspected of possibly trying to topple the Spanish regime. The Chinese, for instance, were given a separate area outside of the walled city, the Parian, and their mobility was kept in check. On the one hand, they were a very important segment of society because of the services they provided, so they had to move freely, but in such a way that they could still be surveilled by the colonial state.
The irony is that's the reason why we have the world's oldest Chinatown.
Yes.
Yes, right? But, okay, one of the things that has interested me in a while that I haven't talked to you about actually is that the Philippines actually used their waterways in the past for transportation of both people and goods, but it feels like that has never been expanded upon. In fact, it felt like it was destroyed as urbanization has happened. Is that a forgotten avenue of transportation in terms of the development of the Philippine society?
Unfortunately, we forgot that specific aspect of our heritage. Throughout much of Manila's recorded history, the waterways were the main avenues of mobility, especially for the ordinary folk. At the time prior to motorization, people moved via the esteros or the estuaries. And that's the reason why, if you compare the two sides of Manila, separated by the Pasig River, the northern districts, because they were served by a more complex set of esteros, they grew more quickly. There were more urban establishments built in that area compared with Paco, Ermita, Malate, which urbanized quite late. The presence of esteros was a very important deciding factor that led to the belated development of the southern part of Manila compared to the northern part. So that explains, I think that goes to show the importance of waterways. Unfortunately, right after the Second World War, there were no longer attempts to revive this cherished aspect of our heritage. Although by the time the automobiles came in the 1910s, 1920s, gradually, slowly but surely, people were already
shifting
away from that.
Okay. Now, Michael, what can you comment on, like, we can see, of course, the ills that we have today are basically just part of a tradition. Like the way, I like it that you said that people who make the decisions aren't usually your average person, are the ones who will be most affected, right? So is there anything that you could, let's take an example, EDSA, which has been much maligned and a lot of brain power has supposedly gone into planning it. Were there decisions in the past that negatively impacted how our metropolis is today, how unfriendly it is to motorists and pedestrians alike?
Yes. I guess we can begin with EDSA. Well, it's not EDSA alone, but the decision to be highway-centric, I guess, beginning in the early or even prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, up until the early years of the post-war period, planners were, as I've said, with the arrival of the automobile and motor buses, the tendency was to disregard other modes of mobility in favor of what appeared to be the efficient automobile, the efficient motor bus.
Yeah.
And so with, for instance, the plan of Louis Croft, who was the brains behind our concentric circumferential road C1 up until C5, that marks an important turning point. And for me, personally, a kind of tragic decision, because that paved the way for a more highway-centric metropolis. And that ran parallel to the decision of the original owners of our railway system, light railway system, the Manila Electric Railroad and Light Company, or now we know as Meralco, their decision to divest from their transport services and just focus on consumer electricity.
No, I want to go left, right, and center here. I can go. I have so many questions, but okay. When we talk about the planning of the circumferential roads, it also normally, I would say, has to consider city plans already.
Yes.
Those currently in place. The circumferential roads happen around 1920s, 1910s, give or take.
Early 1930s, yeah.
The Burnham plan, which is the most famous plan here in the Philippines when it comes to city building or urban planning, was in 1905.
Yes.
With different types of roads. Were other city plans considered when building the circumferential roads, or was it just really to service one growing industry?
Yeah, the problem there is that when Burnham prepared the 1905 plan, he didn't give a, well, like today we have the implementing rules and guidelines or the IRR for a particular law. There should be a guide for how this particular law will be executed years after. But I think the thing there is that Burnham could only do so much. So he already had the vision, the general overview, and the execution was left to the people who would follow after him. The architecture, in fact, was not executed by Burnham himself, but another American architect, William Parsons. And then the execution of the different parts of the plan, it fell on the shoulders of local politicians, Filipino politicians, and even legislators. And they too had their own take on the Burnham plan. So by the time that the highways came to be, the initial C1, C2 of Louis Croft, at that point, by the late 1930s, early 1940s, it was already, Manila as a growing city at that time was already quite far from the original vision that Burnham had in 1905. So that by the post-war era, there was practically no reference to the Burnham plan of 1905. People were now freely creating their own versions of what an ideal city or what an ideal metropolis would be, I think as exemplified by the rise of Quezon City in the early pre-war, in the pre-war era and in the early post-war era.
You know what? That's actually a good time to take a quick break here because I want to focus on Quezon City and, of course, beyond that later on. So we're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll continue our journey through the history of Philippine transportation, rather, from the early days of motorized transit to the growth of Metro Manila, the challenges we face today. Stay with us. We'll be right back. You're still tuned in to BNC, the Billionaire News Channel, and Mellow 947 BFM. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Looking for the perfect escape? Discover Club Nalu, a serene beachfront retreat where stillness meets style. Nestled along the quiet shores of Bacnotan in La Union, Club Nalu is designed for slow mornings, ocean breezes, and moments that help you unwind. From cozy rooms and sun-drenched villas to relaxing spaces inspired by nature. Every corner invites you to pause, breathe, and recharge. Club Nalu, come as you are and leave feeling a little lighter. Book now at clubnalu.ph.
Welcome back. You're still watching Shift Happens, and for those who are just tuning in, I'm Paolo de Rosario, and you're listening on Mellow 947 BFM. Simulcast on BNC, the Billionaire News Channel. And still with us, we're here with historian, associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University. Saying that's just so weird to me as a Lasallian. Author of A Capital City at Margins, Michael D. Pante. Thank you so much for staying with us. I want to talk about Quezon City because that is the main topic of your next book coming up. Excited for that, by the way. The problem with Quezon City that I see personally, you can disagree with me or fight me on this if you want, is the fact that when they were planning it pre-war, it felt like it was planned with with the car in mind and not necessarily any other mode of transportation. And until today, it feels like we're still paying the price for that type of
Or
vision.
pedestrians, for that matter. Paolo.
Or pedestrians, for that matter, in general. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of the early history of Quezon City. Quezon City was established in 1939, and by that time, the automobile was already the king of the road. The Karomatas and Kalesas were on their way out. At the same time, the electric streetcar pioneered by Meralco in 1905, Meralco was already beginning to rethink its decision to invest in electric railways, given that by the 1920s, they already had a sizable fleet of motor buses. So these motor buses didn't have to rely on tracks for them to move, unlike the less flexible railway systems of the original electric streetcar. So by that time, automobility was the way to move around, especially if you had the means of buying your own personal car or paying for a taxi fare. So when Quezon City was established in 1939, there were no Meralco streetcar routes that went from Manila to Quezon City. And the initial residents, in fact, were complaining they had a hard time trying to find a public transport system that would connect them from Manila to the new city. And then fast forward to the post-war era, all the more that we would see this particular problem that I guess was also enabled by the free trade system. At that time, between the U.S. and the Philippines, the U.S. wanted the Philippines to continue to be a market for its manufacturers, tax-free via the Bell Trade Act of 1946. So imagine manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, being able to ship to the Philippines, to export their manufactured automobiles to Filipino consumers without having to pay taxes. So with highways feeding that demand, all the more that we would see politicians catering to a highway-centric kind of mobility.
So you're saying that our government overcommitted and allocated more time and resources to the rise of automobiles, as you said.
Yes.
Can we also trace the shortage or our shortcomings in public transportation to those days? Na yun nga, bumitaw ang Meralco for the... I was hearing stories from my lolo, yung trambia ba tawag doon?
Yes,
Yeah, trambia.
So, should we have... Was that a bad decision?
Yes.
Should we have promoted public transportation more during those days?
Yes, personally, that's my take, that the decision to go highway-centric, and I think that's also in parallel with the moves of the U.S. at that time. Eisenhower was the president in the 1950s, the interstate system, and the boom in the manufacturing of the Philippines for General Motors, and the lack of foresight of our Filipino politicians to go back in time and see what was the success of Meralco as a mass transit system. Can you imagine? 1905 was the start of Meralco as a mass transit system, and the next time that we would have a similar version of that for the metropolis is in the 1980s with the arrival of LRT, the first LRT line. So that's a huge gap between two different sets of mass transit systems. What happened in between?
Well,
so I think that's the root cause of many of our problems right now.
Actually, I was going to say what happened in between is this. What I'm holding right now, which is a Philippine
Nag-jeep ka
jeepney.
ba, Pao?
No, I have. I'm not often, to be honest. Okay, I'm not going to pretend. Okay, I'm not going to pretend. But at the same time, when we talk, you said it's hard to get in Quezon City back in the day. And the only way to go about it if you can't afford a car, and again, even today, there are around, I believe, 90+% of Philippine households who don't own a vehicle. You're using this because it's cheap transportation, and this fulfilled a need. Until now, we see them plying the roads. I mean, I don't think that's changing anytime soon based on what we're seeing.
Yes, that's true. And for me, personally, that's one of my gripes against the government, especially with the whole controversy surrounding the PUV modernization program, with a lot of drivers complaining that it's hard for them to join the so-called cooperatives that would purchase these new vehicles as part of the modernization program. Because if you think about it, historically speaking, these drivers, these operators, essentially subsidized the mobility needs of many of our countrymen living in the cities. Instead of the government pouring in investments in mass transit, what they saw was that, okay, so apparently they could rely on jeeps, even if they're cramped, even if it's a very informal way of moving, the jeepneys did their job. But the thing is that the government didn't meet the jeepney drivers halfway. And then fast forward to the past few years, now it's the government relegating them to a historical relic as if they weren't big contributors to the development of our cities.
So what's your take on that, though? Is the PUVM, Public Utility Vehicle Modernization Program, is that, how are you supposed to, because I also see the need. I mean, a lot of these jeepneys are clunkers, they emit a lot of smoke and all of that. What's the most prudent way that would satisfy both groups of stakeholders?
As jeepney drivers have always articulated, they're not against modernization. The problem there is that when you ask what modernization are we talking about, modernization for whom, then that becomes a tricky question. Because apparently for the government, it seems to me that modernization for them is simply replacing old dilapidated jeepneys with new ones imported from abroad. When in reality, the government can step in given that it has the resources. Money that's billions and billions of taxpayers' money
na sa flood
na
control.
nauubos essentially sa flood control could have been diverted to stimulating a local industry. Now that we're talking about pack silica and national industrialization, it kind of feels weird that if the government really wants a kind of nationalist industrialization, then it should focus on manufacturers that are local. In fact, Sarao, I guess, had a proposal to build these jeepneys, but the government wants to simply import from abroad.
We had them on the show to talk about that, actually. But, okay, Sir Michael, we're running out of time. But I want to leave this on a more positive note. Kasi if not, galit lang tayo eh.
Yeah.
The focus of the government right now, and to their credit, is focusing on corridors of development outside of Metro Manila as well. We see it in Bulacan, we see it in Batangas, and all of that. Connectivity is still going to be an issue. How important is it for us to not replicate the mistakes that we've seen in Metro Manila, that we also focus on connectivity and future-proofing the connectivity to those corridors of development?
I think the main factor that we have to consider is the masses, the Filipino masses, because they are the ones providing the work. They're the ones who ensure that our businesses, our schools, government, in fact, they're the ones ensuring that everything works in order. And for them not to have viable and affordable means of moving from their places of residence to their places of work, that's a travesty for me. So for me, the number one thing that the government must focus on is ensuring that there are enough options for the working class Filipinos, whether it's a jeep, whether it's improved LRT, MRT services, for connectivity, for genuine connectivity to happen, it must cater to the Filipino masses.
Ladies and gentlemen, he is a historian. He's the author of Capital City at the Margins, and of course, one of the recipients of the 2025 National Book Development Board publication grant for his upcoming book, Immobile Metropolis, A History of Motorized Transportation in Manila.
For release this year daw, sabi niya.
For release this year. He's also a professor at the Ateneo. You should also teach in Lasal. Michael D. Pante.
And UP represent.
UP na rin. Okay, fine. Sure. Malapit lang yan. All right. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And that concludes our Filipiniana
Well,
flavored show today. And that concludes our roundup of the stories driving the industry forward. I'm Cap Maceda Aguila.
natin ang barong, but I'm Paolo de Rosario. Join us again tomorrow
Missed the memo.
on Shift Happens, your fast track guide to everything on the move, Mondays to Fridays at 2 p.m. only here on BNC, the Billionaire News Channel, and Mellow 947 BFM.